Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar on exercise and diabetes. My name is Dean Kanakis. I'm part of the marketing team here at Medtronic Diabetes Australia, and I'll be your host for tonight's event. Joining us is Deborah, Medtronic Diabetes Ambassador, and Sally Double, speaking from a healthcare professional perspective. So before I get things kicked off, guys, I just want to let you know that if you do have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to reach out to us through our Facebook. That's Medtronic Diabetes Oz, or through Twitter using the handle, or using the hashtag, I should say, MiniMed webinar. Okay, I'll dive into our introductions now. So just again, there's the Facebook website and we're on Google Hangouts. So just to introduce Sally. Sally is a credentialed diabetes educator at the Melbourne Diabetes Educators. A 25-year long career in health, Sally was driven to specialise in diabetes. Her passion is to educate and support people managing diabetes, with a special interest in insulin pump therapy and successfully balancing diabetes with sport. Thank you for joining us tonight, Sally.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you. Now our ambassador speaker is Deborah. Deborah has had type 1 diabetes for over 30 years. She's also the director of PACE, which is a charity that aims to raise awareness of type 1 diabetes. Deb is one of our more active ambassadors. In 2013, she ran 250 kilometres in support of the Brave Hearts Foundation, raising much needed funds. And she also participates in the KMs for Kids runs, which is the former name of PACE. She ran 205 kilometres over 3.5 days to show the positive outcomes of using insulin pump therapy. Thank you for joining us, Deb.
Thanks for having me, Dane.
Pleasure. So to dive in, the first question is for you, Deborah. So how have you found a pump helps to avoid hypos after exercise?
Prior to using the pump, I was exercising and just expecting to hypo. An example of that was back in 2013, I took part in the Sydney Marathon and ended with blood sugars of 1.6. It was probably 5 minutes off the back of an ambulance at the end of that event. I started on the pump probably 6 months to 12 months after that. With the pump and CGM, the hypos have all been but eliminated. So the beauty of the pump is you can set temp basals. So instead of having with injections, you're doing long-acting and slow-acting insulin. So with a pump, you don't have the long-acting insulin. So it gives you greater control in the short and long term particularly with endurance events. So for example, I can tell the pump that I'm about to undertake something active, whether it be running, cycling, swimming, just being a mum in general, and I can tell the pump to give her a reduced rate of insulin for that period to avoid the hypo. I think the biggest thing for me in regard to hypos was the delayed hypo. So it's not just the hypo that happens during the exercise, it's the hypo that would happen later on, so during the night when it's at its most dangerous. And that was something that was happening constantly with myself prior to the pump. So with the pump and using it particularly with CGM and its smart guard capabilities, the pump has eliminated that mostly. There's always the odd hypo still in there, but very rarely.
Thank you very much for that, Deb. So over to you, Sally. Our first question for you is, how can I avoid hypos after exercise?
Well, I think obviously the best way to target this question is to really look at what people are doing prior to even starting their exercise. So as Deb said, the pump, insulin pump therapy gives a lot of great flexibility in relation to your background or basal-based insulins. But what we need to do is really understand how the individual operates with their insulin prior to even starting their sport or their exercise. So for those that are on insulin pump therapy, I think it's really important to understand your active insulin or your profile of your current insulin. And obviously people on insulin pumps only use rapid-based insulins. So they only really have to get their head around one type of insulin to start with. Those that are still on injections or multiple daily injections also have to consider the backgrounds or their basal-based insulins and what that profile actually is. So I think also on top of understanding your insulins, you need to understand your foods, because we all know that, you know, we've been taught about carbohydrates and the influence of carbohydrates, but I think also trying to understand how which carbohydrates work best for you as an individual, whether it's a combination of carbohydrates, fats and proteins. So all those things I think can also help people try and avoid the management or keep things as stable as possible in relation to exercise. So when people have exercised or individuals have exercised, I think the important thing to consider is, firstly, as we know, some exercises can push people's levels quite high. Obviously, if we're looking at endurance-based exercises, generally that's not the case. And generally people tend to run quite low, exactly as Deb's indicated with one of her marathon events. So, but what we need to do is say, well, what do I need to do here? You know, after exercise, please ensure that you don't correct an elevated blood glucose level within about an hour. Try and see where your blood glucose level is going, because you're going to be increased sensitivity to your insulin. So generally I would say avoid correcting within an hour of your exercise, or if you are someone that really wants to correct, ensure that you've at least half corrected or reduce that dose of the correction. The other thing that people do is change their insulin doses after exercise. So, of course, I've spoken about what you could do pre as well, but afterwards people will use things such as a temporary basal rate, which is what Deb's already indicated is great, which is, you know, your background. So you can reduce actually how much background's going in, and particularly if you're exercising or doing long, you know, endurance-based sports or exercising in the afternoon, you can do that overnight to try and avoid those hypos when people are asleep, to try and reduce that risk. So I guess my take-home message for that is you may need to reduce your insulin, or definitely reduce your insulin pre and potentially post your exercise. Do not correct within an hour, so make sure you find out where those trends or where those blood glucose levels are going. And perhaps you might need to even half bolus if your meal is within, you know, a couple of hours after that sport as well. So it's really about manipulating it, I think, to try and avoid them.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Sally. So just a quick one. Would you be able to plug in your headphones, because we're getting a bit of static when you're speaking, if that's all right? Thank you very much. So Deb, over to you. Oh, actually, just a quick reminder. If anyone does have any questions, we've got a post up on our Facebook page, Medtronic Diabetes Oz. That's showing the live recording of this webinar. So please feel free to comment underneath there with any questions. And at the end of the webinar, we'll get to those. So next question for you, Deb. What snacks do you eat that won't send your levels too high?
It really depends on the event and what I'm taking part in. So training is very different to an actual event. So with an event, you're obviously aiming to bring your A game and go your fastest. And it depends on the event, whether it be cycling or running. The type of snack will vary. I tend to try and have some good solid carbs in my system, and perhaps set my blood sugars right a little bit higher leading into an endurance event. So instead of having them sitting about, you know, 5.5, 6.5, I would let them ride at about 8 coming into an event, and have something. I'm not a big eater before an event because, you know, some people it just doesn't sit well in their stomach to go out and run 42k after eating, and I'm one of those people, unfortunately. But something like a banana, there's a lot of good things like goo gels and the like on the market that can be used and are quite high in carbs. Runners use them all the time, but they've also got the added benefits for people with type 1. Not only are they full of the good stuff for runners, but they're also full of carbs, which can bump things up as you go. I guess I'm lucky I can use CGM for my events, so I've got that constant feedback. So one of the big factors for me is adrenaline. So prior to an event, I would, prior to starting on the pump and CGM, I would have blood sugars upwards of 18, which was the adrenaline factor, the excitement of the day, which I hadn't experienced through training because the adrenaline factor wasn't there. Through mapping that via the pump and CGM, we could identify that and put in a temp basal that we've touched on before to counteract that, and then know to switch that off and then go on to your, I guess, your event management temp basal to get through the event. It's a very personal thing. Everyone's different. So even if you're a non-type 1 competing in events, it's an individual thing. What works for one person doesn't work for another. For me, I like to map it. So I know exactly when I'm going to need something, and you keep bumping it. It's I tend to be more cautious, I guess, in that rather than going, no, I'll leave it to the next drink station at an event, I might have a goo or I might have a jelly bean or whatever is on an offer at the event to keep things moving. I think for me, the biggest concern with me for quite some time was the post-event. So once the event's over, obviously adrenaline's gone, you've relaxed, you've still got that exercise factor on board, which is difficult to manage as a type 1 for, good 24 hours. And what I have personally found is the longer the event, the longer that the pattern would be there for. So, for example, if I go run a 5K, we tend to work through that pattern a little bit quicker. If I go do a marathon or an ultra marathon, the pattern continues longer. So we need to be more alert. I guess one thing that's come into the factor, and I've got an excellent diabetic educator, Liz, and that was something that we had to work quite a lot on, was factoring protein into it. So rather than carbs, we looked at diet to avoid that later onset hypo. And we use protein, and we still use that quite successfully now.
Right. Thank you very much. So in terms of performance, like versus using pens onto a pump, have you seen much of a difference when you moved onto a pump?
Massive difference. So prior to going on the pump, it was just an expectation that there was going to be a sugar load. And that was just how it was. The thought of not running never occurred to me, which is probably silly at the time prior to the pump. But, you try and live your life to the fullest, and you don't want to be different to anyone else. And I guess that's the clincher with most type 1s. Once I started on the pump, even without CGM, the control over the diabetes was instant. So instead of going, right, well, this is just how it is, I guess I found that not only did I have more control, I had better, not only short-term, but long-term control. So not just at the event, post-event, and in the days to follow. And that was due all to the pump, and can be even tighter controlled. And I guess with CGM now, you can map. So it will vary event to event. It will vary sport to sport, it's interesting because recently I tried cycling as something new to running, because running eventually takes its toll on your knees. But I tried cycling, and it's a completely different game, cycling, to what running is. So you might cycle 40k, but you need a completely different set of rules for your pump management, your CGM, and what food and carbs you take in. So it's very much an individual thing, and I think the main thing for me has been having a team that understands my management and my diabetes and my goals. And I think that together with the pump, one of the most important things has been having a fantastic diabetic educator and endocrinologist, and working as a team with them.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Deb. So, Sally, back to you. I have a child who loves exercise and constantly eats carbs. How can I manage the highs from constant eating?
So I'm just going to confirm that you can hear me, I guess, now.
Yep.
Great. So as Deb sort of touched on as well, I think what we need to do is remember that everybody is completely individual. Everybody's responses to foods, and obviously including protein, which is a very important part when people are exercising, and sustainability of often glucose levels, we certainly do see in athletes or anyone that's exercising really. So I think that surrounding yourself with a team, as Deb said, is a really, really important factor, and that could be, you know, people with a range of experience. That certainly includes, you know, your educators, your dietitians and your endocrinologists, and obviously the person and any of their significant others. So getting into, you know, a child who loves to exercise, and as we know, every different exercise is going to do something different. So is it a training session for a basketball game? Is it actually a competitive game, you know, with basketball? Is it football? Is it soccer? Is it cycling? Is it running? So all these different sports, as Deb has certainly indicated, you really do have to manage them quite differently. So it's really about drawing on some support in relation to developing some strategies to work through that. So often the challenge we've got, of course, with children or those that are certainly in teenage years, and when they do exercise a lot, they're certainly growing as well. So they have a huge, huge appetite. So what I often find people do is that instead of always consuming large quantities of carbohydrates, certainly with dietitian experience as well, is that they will look at maybe combining you know, a little bit of protein in there, you know, some good fats in there, because we do find that then we don't need to dose necessarily as aggressively, and it can often stabilise some fairly good levels pre, post and even during some of these actual, you know, sports or exercises that they choose to do. Obviously, as you'd be aware, that any form of carbohydrate, generally speaking, on its own, and some forms of protein, if certainly assessed correctly, will need some sort of bolus-based insulin or insulin to try and, you know, adapt to that. So I think when we're combining activities, I think it's about saying, well, what gives the goals that this individual's after? You know, is it performance that we're after? Is it enjoyment? Is it coming out the other end, as Deb said, with some reasonable levels that you can then, you know, keep control of or keep monitoring with? So what is it that we're actually after, and what is it that we're trying to achieve? So I guess we don't ever want to say to somebody, you can't have that or you can't eat that, but perhaps it's how we actually spread out those carbohydrates and look at combining them in relation to those sports. The other thing I just want to sort of touch on there, though, is we've also got to make sure that we're well hydrated, because when we're doing any form of exercise, of course, hydration state is hugely important. And we do find sometimes that if we're not well hydrated, that can obviously, you know, sometimes our body thinks, well, maybe we want to eat more. So maybe ensure that you're well hydrated as another point in relation to that. And also, as you know, I get a lot of my clients managing type 1 diabetes sometimes say if their levels get really high or quite elevated, or they're doing a lot of swinging around in relation to highs and lows, the body's really a little bit unsure about how it's obtaining that energy, and often they feel extra hungry or feeling like they need to satisfy with more sort of easy carbohydrates to actually get rid of that feeling. So I think, again, I go back to the fact of saying you've got to analyse what we're doing. As Deb said, she's able to map because she uses CGM or continuous glucose monitoring. So it's really about just assessing what's going on, and then we can hopefully modify how we're going to manage some of the highs from the constant eating. Hope that gives a little bit of something.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Sally. So just another quick reminder, guys, if you do have any questions, please don't be afraid to reach out. You can reach out to us through Medtronic Diabetes Oz. We do have a post up, and we'd love to see some questions from the crowd there. Okay, so back over to you, Deb. Oh, sorry, my mistake. This one's for Sally again. Sally, how long after meals should I wait before exercise in order to have the best chance of burning excess fat?
Okay, I think, again, that's a really great question and a very individual question. I think we have to remember that when we exercise, and whether that be or when we're even resting, actually, our body will use carbohydrates and fat as an energy source, and we obviously store a lot of energy as well in, you know, cells in the liver. We have all sorts of stores everywhere. So some people often find that in actual fact, when they're just doing a fairly low intense activity for 30 to 45 minutes, they will be burning some fat and they'll be burning carbohydrates. Just to sort of clarify, I think the longer the duration of exercise that you're doing, so more these endurance-based sports that Deb does a fair bit of, when we're looking at that, is that obviously we need glucose or we need carbohydrate because the body's really, it needs that energy source to be able to use that. So there's been a lot of research that's certainly gone on saying, well, when is the best time to exercise? Do we exercise before we eat a meal? Do we exercise after we've eaten a meal? Where do we get the best response if it's related to weight loss? And for this particular question, obviously looking at fat burning. So for some individuals, and there's actually a bit of a discrepancy in what people actually believe works, is that some people actually find that they're better to exercise first thing in the morning without actually, so that they can utilise some of their stores. But be very, very mindful that if you're getting up to exercise first thing in the morning and you're doing something that actually requires good energy levels, well, you might find that in actual fact you still need 10 or 15 grams of carbohydrate just to give you some energy to actually get through that event. But the other thing that they do, that some people find, is in actual fact don't eat after your meal. So, leave it about a couple of hours after your meal and then wait about a couple of hours after you've exercised before you actually do start consuming more food, if you're able to, obviously from a blood glucose perspective, because they do find then that you're obviously, going to replenish some of those stores, you'll change the way the metabolism works and potentially access, fat-based stores in relation to that. But I guess my simplest idea for most people is to say, well, the best chance really is that if you're able to push yourself to further endurance-based sports, mix it up with a little bit of intensity, so vary your actual sports that you're doing, and then you might actually find that that works most beneficially to you. And if we can also keep fairly steady levels, reduce the hypoglycemic events that occur during or after, so that you don't have to consume excess energy just to ensure that you can keep those levels up. So it's a tricky question to answer. I don't think one strategy fits everybody, and I think it's really about working with your healthcare team to really identify which way for you is going to work best. But I guess like anybody, when you're exercising, you really don't want to have to always eat for your insulin, so it's about how we can adapt your intakes and your insulin doses just to ensure that you're eating for what you need.
All right, thank you very much for that, Sal. So back over to you, Deb. Do you have extra carbs before exercise or reduce your insulin? What have you found works best and what made you choose the method?
Carbs is an interesting one. Doing marathons, you quite often hear people talk about carb loading. And carb loading isn't just a bowl of pasta the night before an event. It's a process that goes on throughout your entire training, which is usually a 12-week lead-in to an event. For me, as I said, eating before an event creates issues during the event. So I guess I'm sensible and I reduce the insulin to fit the carbs, and the pump gives me the ability to do that. So, for example, what works for me is, as I indicated before, adrenaline's a factor for me. So we will give it a temp basal of somewhere up to 140%. Leading into the event from when I wake up to counteract the adrenaline, and then we will turn that off an hour or so prior to the event because that basal will still be working for some time after we turn it off. We then turn it on to a reduced basal, which will see me through to the end of the event, and that reduced basal will also depend on the length of the event. So, for example, on the weekend I did a 5K event and we used 60% of my normal basal rate. And, we started with blood sugars of 7. As I said, I let it go that little bit higher. And then we finished with blood sugars of 4.9. And that continued for the rest of the day along that pattern. So there was no real variance in it. But if I go out and do a marathon, for example, obviously the stress on the body and anyone's body, whether they're type 1 or not, is much, much more. And it takes a lot more work to keep that in check. one of the biggest things for me has been with the pump and with the access to CGM is it's there on my hip, so there's no surprises. So the pump alerts to me that your blood sugars are trending down, and it will give me a rate of alert. So you're either going down in a hurry, you need to be acting on this now prior to the low happening, and we can act on that, whether it be with the goo, gel, jelly beans, whatever you've got stashed in your run belt. You know, rather than being a pack horse, you tend to try and plan these things at drink stations, and that you know what's at the drink stations. I guess with the CGM also, as I said, it suspends before load, but it'll also alert to you going the other way. So, for example, if you take too much carb on board, and it happens, you can muck up, and you're heading the other way, the pump will also alert to that and go, hold on, I've at least got your attention and you need to be aware of this. So I guess for me, it's taken the guess factor out of it. I mean, you don't know one event to the next. Diabetes is like that in day-to-day life for anyone, but you throw into the mix doing silly things like marathons, it makes it that little bit worse. But the pump adapts to that and it helps you manage it. And particularly with the CGM, before there's an issue, you know about it. So I guess for me, the tip I would give is, one, having access to CGM is important. Of course, not everyone has that benefit, but having a plan in place. So with or without CGM, the pump allows you to be, and as I said, in training with your educator, with your doctors and your team, you can come up with a plan, and a plan that works. So I can say what works for me mightn't work for the next 10 people. And for me, it might work at one event, but it mightn't work to that degree to the next event. And that's just what diabetes is. The beauty of the pump is it gives you that flexibility to adapt. And it's not, as I said before, it's your basal insulin isn't that you've injected the night before and you've got long-acting insulin on board you've got no control over. You've got much more control because your basal insulin is coming from the pump, and it's a short-acting insulin. So it gives you much, much greater control. So usually my pump will go into suspend during an endurance event. So we've got an event down here in Hobart called Point to Pinnacle, which is a half marathon running up a mountain for 21K. And it's an expectation. I know it's going to suspend 10K in, and it won't be pumping insulin until we get to the end. But I know because the pump's constantly telling me that that's what it's doing, and then it's constantly telling me what we can do after. And that's the beauty of it. It's the flexibility, and it allows you to do these crazy things that you want to in life.
Right, thank you very much for that, Deb. Okay, so back over to you, Sally. Are there common problems you see with diabetes and exercise, particularly during warmer days?
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to elaborate a little bit further on what Deb's been talking about in relation to, using some technologies to try and map what's going on. And as Deb said, that, if you're using pump therapy, well, obviously you've got some greater flexibility with, different patterns that you can set for different events. So I've got a few people that I work with that certainly partake in Ironman events, and a lot of cyclists as well. And so you'll often find that they will develop, different basal profiles or patterns that they'll use on different for different events. And whether that's an increase, as Deb said, to cope with, some counter-regulatory hormone response prior to the actual events with the sort of fight and flight or the nervousness that kicks in. And then obviously petering off when you're doing long endurance-based activities, because your body really still needs some form of insulin on board, but basically certainly needs a lot more carbohydrate to deal with that as well. I will bring in the certainly warmer days as we go, but in relation to technologies, I think, Deb's been using CGM for a period of time, so she certainly understands how that product works and how it works for her in relation to how she can, map out what's going on with different exercises. I think it's really important that if anybody does decide that that is an area that they'd like to progress their management to, and they're able to, that it's really important you understand how that device works for you and how you can assess the trends and, you know, and make it work. I think any technology, as we know by anything that we all do, occasionally it needs to be managed. So if, for example, you were doing a, you know, an endurance event or a marathon, and your devices were indicating that you were, you know, rising, but you weren't feeling that way in relation to how your body was, it's really important that you still have a backup plan, like Deb was saying, in relation to potentially finger stick testing to ensure that, you know, what you're actually seeing on your device is still, you know, what you know as. Along with that, you know, if you are sitting really high, perhaps you need to check for some ketones just to ensure that your body is still having a good transition of energy source appropriately, that you can still perform without, you know, really elevated levels that might hamper your or ketone levels, which, you know, is creating an acidic environment that would then disrupt your performance. So that the reason I bring that up, I guess, is because we're talking about warmer days. So when people exercise in warmer weather, they often find their requirements will actually change. So even though they've done some great planning or lead up into particular events, that if all of a sudden on the day that they're choosing to do their marathon, it decides it wants to be 38 degrees, well, I think you're going to have some sort of additional information to cope with the hot weather. Earlier I said hydration is hugely important with any form of exercise. So of course when you're I think, you know, hydration state is really important, and it could be that some of your carbohydrate replacement is through your hydration in relation to doing that. The other thing is that some people find that when it's hot, it actually elevates their levels. Others find that when it's hot, it actually drops their levels. And as Deb said before, that, you know, no two people are actually the same, and their responses are going to be different. So I think that you need to understand how your body reacts to these things, and weather being one of them, and how you might actually modify your plan if you'll come up against that. The other thing I will just bring up is that insulin sites, so cannula sites in relation to your pumps or your CGM. Some people actually find that when they perspire a lot, and obviously being in hot weather and exercising in hot weather, that can often be the case, is we need to ensure that these things are stuck down well, so that we know that the technology that we're using is also going to, you know, give us what we need through the whole event. So there's lots of little strategies and tips you can use for different tapes or different preparations to use underneath these tapes. If you are going to be exercising, you know, in the warmer weather, and particularly through, you know, summer. So, you know, I certainly have a lot of little things that we work through with, you know, preparing the sites pre these sort of events. So, yeah, hot weather, keep hydrated, I guess, is the best thing, but also have a backup plan for when you're going to exercise in the hot weather, because you might find it doesn't go to as you thought it was going to do.
Right, thank you very much for that, Sally. So, Deb, back over to you for our last question of the evening before we go into our questions off YouTube Live. So what impact has an insulin pump had on your ability to manage good blood glucose levels while being active?
Nothing but positive. I guess prior to going onto the pump, I was hypo unaware. Certainly wasn't helped by the fact I was running silly distances and you know, marathons and the like. I guess for me, the pump was a game changer in that it was life-saving and it was life-giving, in that it let me continue to do something I loved and had always done. I could just do it more safe and more sensibly, I guess. My blood sugar levels now, as I said, having access to CGM, I now know there's a pattern. My educator knows there's a pattern, because when I upload the pump to CareLink, she can view it that night or the next day, and we can map the patterns. So we know what patterns are there. As we've said, it all varies depending on what you're doing at the time, but nothing but positive. I think for anyone doing endurance sports or any sort of sports, I can't recommend a pump highly enough. And strangely enough, I was one of those people that went, I don't want a pump, I don't want something attached to my hip, I don't need it. This was the girl that was also hypoing probably, you know, 5 and 6 times a week. until I met someone that was on a pump who was also doing endurance sports. And strangely enough, we went for a run together, and he showed me his pump and told me basically what it could do. And from that moment on, the inquiry started, well, hold on, maybe this thing can actually improve my life. But it hasn't just improved my life, it's also improved my family's life, because they don't have the stress that mum is going to come home and go low overnight and going to have to call an ambulance. My blood sugar sits, you know, mostly within the range of 7 to 4.5. Every now and again we get a dip or we get a rise. That's just what diabetes is. But my control over it at the moment is probably the best it's been in 30 years, and that's a result of the pump.
Right, thank you very much for that, Deb. Okay, so we'll move into our questions we've received online. Thanks to Chris for posting a question. So, Sally, I think the first part of this question should be for you. How should basal insulin be managed if the pump is taken off for exercise? For example, swimming, training, or for a half marathon?
Okay, great question. There's actually a few ways that you can manage that. It depends how long you're actually going to be off the pump for. So if you're going to be off for, under about 2 hours, then sometimes we find that some supplement-based basal insulin as rate can be administered, or half that dose can be administered prior to the event and prior to being disconnected. It also actually does depend whether you've got a lot of active insulin on board prior to actually disconnecting. So if you're someone that's going to go and swim for 2 hours, or going to go do a squad session for 2 hours of swimming squad, you might find that if you've recently had a bolus dose of insulin for a small snack of food prior to actually going in, that insulin along with the exercise will actually cover that 2 hours that you're disconnected, and you won't need to do anything else. If you're going to be disconnected for a much longer period of time, be that a football game, be that a soccer game, because they're obviously contact-based sports, which make it quite difficult to keep your pump on for, and they go for a longer period of time, or if you're disconnecting for a half marathon, some people either keep their pump with them and obviously connect up at short periods to give small doses, or if people want to have a break from it completely, then we may need to return to some basal-based insulin as an injectable, as a very small dose, just to give some sort of cover if you're going to be off for a long duration of time. And they're the sort of strategies that you really need to work with your healthcare team to help you troubleshoot through some of that. So there's plenty of ways to work through it. Some of it can be done through the pump pre and post. Some needs to have a little bit of supplement back to what people knew as their background insulin.
Thank you very much for that, Sally. Okay, Deb, so part of the question for you is, do you recommend taking the pump off for an endurance race?
I actually don't, but I'm using it with CGM, and the pump's telling me what my body's doing. I wouldn't personally take it off for an endurance race, because I think it gives you that level of control. So if you disconnect from the pump for a half marathon, full marathon, whatever it may be, even something shorter, it sort of leaves you in the lurch a little bit, so you don't know what's going on. So even if I disconnected from the pump in that I've got it on me but I'm not attached, I then don't want to find out that my blood sugars are spiking and I have to then reattach it and that sort of thing. So I stay attached to it, and the pump does what it wants to do. So the pump does the thinking for me, I guess. So it will suspend and not give insulin when it can see there's an issue on the way, whether it be with a blood sugar, or it will alert and tell me that my blood sugars are on the way up. With endurance, they're always on the way down, but the pump will grab that before it actually happens. So no, I don't disconnect from the pump, and I think one of the things, and as I said before, I prior to going on the pump, one of the things I said, well, I don't want to be attached to that thing. And I think that's one of the main things that people have a concern about with the pump, and particularly active people, is that when I run with the pump, I don't know it's there. So I run with a run belt and an iPod, and it's absolutely no different to doing that. In fact, people go, oh, cool iPod. So it even looks funky on your hip. So for me, I stay on the pump. I let it do what it wants to do. And I think the main thing that I've had to learn to do is to trust the pump. So I trust in the pump, and I have the experience with the pump, I guess, and that's something that happens over a period of time, in that I know when it suspends, even if it's suspending at 7, it's predicting that there's going to be an issue. So that might seem, well, geez, why are you suspending at 7? That's, you know, slightly above in range, but it's predicting that there's going to be an issue. So no, I don't disconnect from the pump, and I certainly, look, swimming's, interestingly enough, is a different thing. The pump is waterproof, so I jump in and out the pool all the time with it, without any issue there. So it depends on what level of swimming you're doing, and it was like we said before, different exercise has a different effect on your blood sugars, and swimming for me is instant, let's head downwards. So in that case, I leave the pump on if I'm just having a muck around in the pool with my family, but I may disconnect from it if I'm going to swim seriously, which in all honesty isn't that, but often because I'm not much of a swimmer. But yeah, for me, and look, again, it's personal preference and what you work out with your team, but for me, I don't remove the pump to exercise.
Right, thank you very much for that, Deb. Okay, guys, so that will conclude tonight's webinar. I just want to say a very special thank you to Deb and Sally for joining us. It's been great having you guys on, and I hope that everyone out there has gotten some great insights out of tonight's event. Just a quick reminder, we do have a great team here at Medtronic Diabetes Australia who would be willing to help you at any time. Please feel free to reach out to us on our helpline number at 1800 777 808. You can also reach out to us through our Facebook page, Medtronic Diabetes Oz. We've also got an Instagram account, Medtronic Diabetes Oz. And we've also got a patient site, medtronic-diabetes.com.au, with lots of great information on it. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you very much to Sally and Deb for providing some great insights.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dane.